why don't we just start, Michelle, with the feature and the scope of a profile of a serial killer that I had never heard of until we had talked about this story.
Right, yeah. He was, and frankly, I'm not sure that at his heyday, people knew much about him either, because that's part of the reason he flew under the radar. There was an unknown offender was raping women in the 1970s and started in 76 in Sacramento. He quickly became known as the East Area Rapist. And he, after about rape 15, 16, that entire Sacramento, Contra Costa County, they were just gripped by this. He seemed to mysteriously disappear in July of 1979. And separate from that, there started to be some offenses in Southern California in which usually couples were killed in Santa Barbara County, in Ventura, in Irvine. And that they called him the original Night Stalker. And it wasn't until 2001 when DNA got good enough that in a lab they went, oh my God, this has been the same guy. There had been speculation that it was the same guy, but they finally knew it was the same guy.
Right. So just to get the count, 50 rapes, known as the East Area Rapist in Northern California, a gap in the 1970s, in a gap of time, the guy disappears, and then suddenly there are, or over the course of a few years, in the 1980s, I think you said 1980 to
the murders were from 79 to 86.
So from 79 to 86, there surfaces a killer in Southern California who is not connected to all of these crimes, but whose ultimate body count is 10 murders. Now that's in Orange County, Dana Point, Ventura, Santa Barbara. And so what's, I guess, intriguing in what you're saying is that there was not an official connection between those identities in the murder and the rapist until 2001. We're talking decades of a cold case.
Right. So by that time, it's a very cold case. People's memories have faded. It's a confusing name. It doesn't grab the attention of the public. And it kind of just went under the radar. And yeah, so.
It's funny because as we were working on this story, Michelle, you're obviously sort of an expert on unsolved cases and some of the most violent mysteries and murders in history on your blog, True Crime Diary. And what's interesting is that talking about this story was really complicated because, and you hate to think about it, but marketing a serial killer is something to think about. The name East Area Rapist - Original Night Stalker is a horrible serial killer name. And then in his abbreviation, which is...
I call him Eron. Some people say EAR. I mean, again, this is part of the problem. You talk to some detectives, they say EAR. You talk to other, they say ONUS. I mean, it's all over the place.
So it's a total cluster.
Yeah.
So for the sake of the article, to simplify things and also just to keep the reader, to keep the one guy straight, you renamed him the Golden State Killer. It was actually something that the editors decided with your help in just giving him one identity. So just so that readers know, he's known as Eron's, he's known as East Area Rapist, he's known as a serial original Night Stalker, but we went with Golden State Killer.
Yeah, and that was something I came up with just because what I kept coming back to was just looking at the state and seeing how he kind of snaked his way down the state. And it was just California, and so that it just made sense that was the, sort of, organizing principle behind what was going on there. So that's sort of the state that, California was kind of where I went with that.
Before we get into the specifics of how you researched for this piece and the journalism that you did in order to get a lot of the information that you got, which is a staggering amount and probably the first ever in any kind of, at least, format that I've seen in a magazine or elsewhere, talk a little bit about your background, because this part of this story is not just trying to track down a serial killer, it's also how you are going about it and the methods that you use, and it's connected to True Crime Diary. So talk about your blog a little bit and then your sort of interesting way of going about it.
Well, part of the reason I started the blog is I've always had an interest in unsolved crimes, probably because they're like puzzles, and it was just something that always interested me. And once the internet started to change and more information became available, I found myself really kind of puzzling these out online, and would come across information that was interesting and valuable, and it felt like investigative reporting to me. So
yeah.
But I didn't want to become. There's a lot of this story is that of me not wanting to sort of like, because a lot of people say, well, why don't you go into law enforcement? And it's like, aside from the fact that I'm the worst person in the world to be given a gun, I don't like, I'm not an organization person. So this was always kind of this like kind of little thing I did. And I've always kind of wanted to keep, kind of,
it's a weird hobby, I gotta say.
Yeah.
And I think the part that is really intriguing and something that it took me a long time to understand, you and I have been working on this piece, I think, almost a year now in its development, and have been talking about it for a long time. Something that was really intriguing to me is what happened to you at 14 in your memory there, and how that really factors into the driving curiosity that you have, that it's not about the details of the murders, it's the puzzle piece.
Right. Like, so what happened when I was 14 is I grew up in Oak Park, Illinois, which is outside Chicago, and a neighbor very close by was brutally murdered the summer I was 14, and it really kind of shocked our town, and it was headline news for sure. But what it really just particularly, and I don't think up until that point I had been interested in murder at all or unsolved crimes. I was just very gripped by this story and very shocked by it, and very obsessed with kind of the blankness of this person's face, that we didn't know who may be like slinking by us covered in blood. I mean, it just seemed so unbelievable to me that someone among us, presumably because it was just a, kind of laid back residential area, was a cold-blooded killer who had cut this woman's throat. It was terrible. And the way I kind of described it is everyone moved on and I couldn't, and I just obsessed over it. And
not only did you obsess over it, you went back to the scene of the crime and like took a piece of evidence, I guess.
Well, yes, and that's where I start to look a little so strange that I'm not even sure. Yeah.
No,
yeah.
Well, it's a really, really fine point, and I think you take a few steps beyond where most of us would. So
right.
It's interesting because I think it really factors into, at the time, you had practical evidence. You went back and you picked up what
I remember going to the alley where it had happened, and she had been wearing a Walkman. She was jogging, and there was still just like a little I'm sure they presumably again took the whole Walkman. I wasn't,
right.
I didn't put gloves on and then walk over to the homicide department and say, you're welcome. But there was a shard of a Walkman there that I picked up, and I just have a very vivid memory of that. And yes, I do recall not telling anyone I had done this, because I think deep down I knew it was a little offbeat and strange. But that's where it started for sure.
Well, it's interesting because that case wasn't solved either.
No.
And still hasn't been solved. That she was a teenager then in the 80s, and years later, it's still a mystery.
Yeah.
And so I think that is it's curious that still to this day it hasn't been resolved. But what's interesting is that there have been several cases that you've studied ever since. So it became this kind of, just from meeting you and working with you, you're a murder nerd. I think that's how I've called you. You're a murder nerd, and you have a database of knowledge about the macabre.
Yes,
stuff.
That's probably true. But as we were sort of touched upon earlier, it's not like, there's just, it sounds weird, but it's like there's certain genres of crime that interest me.
Okay.
Absolutely not. Like at all. I would never be interested in mafia stuff.
Right.
I'm not interested in really reading a book about the ins and outs of Ted Bundy's mind, because we kind of know what happened with all that. To me, it really is just the puzzle. It's like the amassing of ominous details and then trying to arrange them into something that makes sense. And the possibility of, that a lot of these do get cold very fast. People aren't able to give them the attention they need, and the possibility that some of them could be solved is fascinating to me.
I think in a second I'll ask you why Iran's has been so difficult to solve, but I think first, a little insight into your process, because it is really something that you touched upon. The internet has really changed. Instead of picking up a shard of a Walkman, you're now digging into the obscura of a public file. So talk a bit about that.
Well, it's just knowing kind of there's. You know, and I think we talked about this earlier. There was an op-ed piece recently in the New York Times that coined the term research rapture. And I do think that there's a certain kind of person that, you know, you go down the rabbit hole kind of gleefully, like, oh, there's just this unending thread of information that I can find. So part of what you can do in the internet now is just, it's sort of beyond Google at this point. Anybody can Google stuff, but you know, as a friend of mine said, you know, it's something like there's some study done that like 80% of people don't go beyond the first page of Google. It's like, he's like, and you go to page 30. And so it's going to page 30. It's knowing, one of my little tricks, it's not even a trick, but is knowing that someone you're kind of trying to figure out a lot about, you often go to like a family member or an associate, because often the person you want to know something about, if they seem, a lot of people will just stop if they can't find anything about the person. But you know, there's the other people, you can't control other people essentially, and so those other people will often post pictures of the person of interest from the 1970s that they probably didn't want out there, and then you go, oh, well, that's an interesting tattoo. That was so that kind of thing. But yeah, it's just research at the end. It's just
right. So in the olden days, the pre-internet era, someone's identity, sort of the dissipation of materials and pictures and whatever is left would kind of disappear. But now it's possible that in any sort of yearbook photo, as you studied with the Golden State Killer, or Facebook shot of a friend of a friend of a friend, can possibly be a clue that will be the one revealing clue that is beyond the grasp of the killer himself.
Right, yeah.
So You've earned a reputation, and I'll say this for you because you probably won't say it yourself, that you've earned a reputation as someone who digs deep into these unsolved cases and then posts your theory, and you put out what you think might have happened, or at least some information that a lot of people haven't seen before, and you've developed a following online as a reliable resource and a thoughtful resource on unsolved crimes, and like with spanning from, I think, a John Benet Ramsey post you did recently to this case, which gripped you more than the dozens that you've posted on before. So what is it about Iran's / Golden State Killer that you did the post and then continued on? I mean, we're talking like two and a half years?
Yeah. Yeah, it's probably been about 2.5 years. That's when I first read Larry Crompton's book.
Right.
It's a combination of, and law enforcement authorities who have worked on the case will say the same thing. There's no one like him out there. There hasn't been before. He is such a unique offender, and so you kind of, it's like right when you think you have him figured out, he changes shape, and then you kind of go, oh, well. And the other thing is just there's so many elliptical small clues that he left behind because he had so many offenses. I mean, 50 rapes and 10 murders, there's a lot of clues to sift through. So it's the possibility of sifting through all these things and trying to make sense of it.
I mean, it's just hard for me to believe that there's a benefit in being prolific. I mean, and it's also hard for me to believe that this has not been solved. I mean,
well, you also have to remember, I mean, at the time, and as Larry Crompton, when I interviewed him in person,
we'll just back up and we'll explain who Larry Crompton is. Mm-hmm. Larry Crompton, who is a detective at the Contra Costa County police force and is now retired, is a featured part of your story as a source and also part of your narrative of the guy. Iran's Golden State Killer was the guy that got away. Mm-hmm. And so he published a book on his experience.
Sudden Terror. Mm-hmm.
And you read that.
And I read that. And, a point he made when we sat down to talk about this is, back in the day, if something didn't happen in your jurisdiction, it wasn't in the paper, you didn't hear about it. It just, so the fact that he did offend in all these different jurisdictions meant, it wasn't like people knew that this one guy had done all these things. So you have that going for him. You also, they didn't, there used to be this kind of thought of don't publicize rapes and stuff like that. Don't, because you don't want copycats, you don't want him to change his method. So frankly, I think I talked to some people who didn't feel like it had really gotten out there until like rape 15 or something. So, and one of the victims said it came out later that his MO was that he would break into the house beforehand to get to know the victim. And she said, and that happened to me, and she was victim number 5. And she said, if I had known that, I would have gotten a security system on my house. I would have, it just wasn't out there that's what he was doing. So, I think that that's, he had, it's a complex case. It's got a lot of different jurisdictions, and all those things work in his favor.
It's curious because I guess, obviously DNA has become such a crucial element in how cases are solved. And one sort of sidebar to this story is that his grip on several victims' families because of the atrocities that he committed among so many women, particularly women, led to, I guess it was the murder of the husband or the partner of someone that led to the DNA database idea in California. Right,
yeah. And I've never met him, but Bruce Harrington was the brother of Keith Harrington, who was a murder victim in Dana Point. And Bruce is a lawyer, and he donated a great deal of time and money and to lobbying for Proposition 69, along with Larry Poole, investigator Larry Poole from Orange County worked on this too. So Prop 69, I believe it passed in 2004, but basically what it did was make California an all-felon DNA database. It's got basically, the best DNA database in the country, possibly even the world. It's just, so if you even, if you get a DUI now, you give DNA.
Right.
And part of this also came from what Larry Poole wanted to do was go into he wanted to start in the prison system and test everyone. And that was a problem. So there was a lot of things that happened because of Prop 69.
Right.
Yeah.
So Larry Poole is another detective that was working on the case, and you'll see in the story in the magazine that we do our best to help unstrand multiple jurisdictions, multiple authorities working on several different cases. But fundamentally, the 10 murders were mostly couples, women and men, and the escalation of rapist to murder over the course of several years when he started in the 1970s was something that Larry Crompton, the now retired detective, predicted. Mm. What was his MO as a rapist that had him thinking that this was possible as a future way, method of killing people?
What you mean? What made Larry Crompton believe that he was going to escalate?
I think that it's probably two-pronged. One is what was his MO, which I think was both his signature and part of confusion, and then what particular key moment do you think that Larry Crompton identified this might be something that would grow?
He said that a lot of two things happened. He said the rape victims all believed he was going to kill them. He threatened to kill them. And they very much felt he wanted to kill them and he was going to kill them. And then when he didn't, it was always kind of, he said he would often talk about going into the house for the first time and the victim, just the relief that they were still alive. That's what a lot of victims felt. And so he sensed...
Who's he? Sorry.
Larry Crompton sensed this escalation then. And he went and talked to a psychiatrist who looked over the police files. And the psychiatrist said he's looking for justification. He needs something to justify. He's getting more violent and he wants to kill, but he needs some justification. So he sensed that that's where this was going. And then the other thing was, then there was these two incidents where things went south on the Golden State Killer. So in Danville in July 1979, in Danville, they got away from him. And it was a close call. And then in October of 1979 in Goleta, which is right outside Santa Barbara, they also got away from him. So at that point, no one lived after that.
Right.
So he had 2 really bad incidents, and I think that was his justification, frankly.
Right. So he was as he would target couples and rape the woman, and then torture the husband psychologically in that way. I have to say this is that your first draft made me almost physically ill, and it was something. Again, like you think Law and Order or CSI and all that stuff that we seem to find so fascinating culturally, when you put it in the context, especially with the terrific writing that you did, when you put it in the context of this actually happening, it's hard to take. And some of the details that you told me and that didn't necessarily make it into the magazine piece in full, but we are running in a writer's cut online. Talk to me a little bit about those details, because I think it's important for people to know just how sadistic and clever he was.
Well, in terms of the clever, and what a lot of the detectives would talk to me about is, he would do things like, he did a lot of the pre-surveillance, so he would break into your house.
So before he targeted you, before he would attack.
Right. What I heard over and over again is, what they believe is that he would pick a neighborhood he wanted to hit. He would go around and pick probably several different victims, so that the night he kind of wanted to do his thing, that terrible thing, he had at least someone. So because you would notice that multiple people would be called, a lot of crank calls, things like that. He was trying to figure out who was home. He was doing prowling, so he probably had several different victims.
And his neighborhood of choice, describe that.
Middle class, sometimes upper middle class, but definitely nice. He preferred single-story houses. He wanted the bedroom to be on the first floor. That made it a lot easier. He often there was a green belt close by where he could escape, or a freeway. So then the other thing he would do that was really sort of savvy was he would park just outside the perimeter, sometimes between houses, so no one would say, "What's that weird car right in front of my house?" So it was like just perfectly parked outside the police canvas, so later no one would, again, put the car back to him. Go to the crime scene. He tied them, it was described to me as he tied his victims in such a way that he knew he had a certain amount of time to get away, and it was just the exact amount of time you need to get back to that car and leave. So he had all these methods. What he did to the victims that was particularly sadistic, and the victim that I interviewed described to me as, it really... Again, what came up again and again is this was not about sex. This was about terror and instilling fear and terror in these people. And what he did he would not let you know when he left. So he would make you think he left. He'd act like he'd leave, and then a half an hour when you're just starting to breathe normally and try to get out of your bindings, he'd just appear in the doorway again. So, it was like someone had figured out this sort of all of our primal fears. I mean, he's coming in the middle of the night with a mask.
Right.
Talking through clenched teeth at you. And the other thing that I thought was very noteworthy and that almost every detective brought up to me was this guy had a script in his head, and it went... when you read the police files, it's the same thing over and over again, what he said and what he did. And when it didn't adhere to that script is when he became incredibly agitated. So it was like there was almost like a movie going on in his head.
Right.
And
then I think a detail that I can't get out of my mind was when he escalates from rapist to murderer. So he disappears. In the story, you outline this really well. He disappears. His last rape is in what year?
The attempted rape was July 1979 in Danville.
Right. And so then he suddenly evaporates and then reappears in Southern California. And I think it's Dr. Offerman and his girlfriend, Alexandra Manning, is the most haunting and disturbing elements. And for me, it's the turkey carcass.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's so many things about that crime that are so sort of bizarre and beyond tragic. I mean, it's bizarre because it was right near Christmas.
Yeah.
So there was this Christmas turkey, and And yeah, so but eating at the crime scene was a very common thing with him.
Well, we'll explain what the story is, and then we can.
So the story is basically that when the police officers arrived with the call of the bodies at the Offerman condo, they had to step around this turkey that was in plastic wrap. That had bones and been kind of chewed on and things like that. So it was clear that he had taken out the turkey, this Christmas turkey, which was made specifically for Dr. Offerman, and eaten it, and right. Yeah, and
so after he kills a couple in cold blood, I think execution style for the husband, and you can read in the story the further details, which again are really, really well written, and so it's somehow it's gruesome but literary. So well done, Michelle. But it's that right after he murders people, he goes out and eats it.
Well, or possibly, we don't know. He could have tied them up, and then because something he did with the rapes was he tied you up, and then in his sort of weird fidgety way would go and eat in your kitchen. So. Possibly he probably wanted the gunshots are loud. He probably wanted to get out of there, frankly. So it may have been that he tied them up, then went to. If you want to really screw with people, what you're going to do is make them terrified, have them tied up, and then you're going to eat their Christmas dinner. That's just a terrible element too.
So eating was part of his psychological intimidation. What are the other examples of that?
Of the psychological intimidation?
We were going to back up and talk about the eating. Yeah.
Just, comes up again and again. This victim number 5 that I talked to, he went in, she said he was clanking around with pots and pans, was going to make something to eat. He ate apple pie at one person's house. He ate a lot. And it was, I don't know, that's probably some sort of, this is my, if you want to really get in someone's space and dominate them, I guess maybe eating in their home when they're terrified, it's probably just goes along with that. I've racked my brain what else it could mean. Was he, he'd said a lot of things that a lot of the detectives feel were kind of a put on, but I'm not so sure. It was a lot of this stuff of I'm living out of my van, stuff like that. So was he hungry? I don't.
Oh, so he would use some sort of what you think what police thought was a ruse.
Well, he would often say, "I need money." Mm-hmm. He definitely was using the money thing as a ruse because he would, for instance, in one he cut off a ring from someone or threatened to cut off a ring unless she gave it to him, and then so it was this big deal, and she gave it to him, and then they found it later in the patio. So the ring didn't really matter. It was, it's a way to tell someone that you're not there to hurt to. Lie to deceive them by saying you're not there to hurt them, you just want their money, and then you basically get them to comply, and then you do what you want to do.
Right.
So that's so. But he did see it was what comes up a lot is I need food and money for my van. I need money. A lot of stuff about van. His van, things like that. So, other things don't. Make him seem a little bit more middle class, and then maybe that was a put on. I don't know, but the eating was always very strange to me.
So the taking of personal effects sometimes before he physically assaulted the victims is a really crucial part of your story, mm-hmm. and the story opens with you researching a pair of cufflinks that you think might belong to one of the victim's partners or husbands. So let's talk about that as a starting point. How are the cufflinks, at least in the story that you're telling for the magazine, this crucial moment in sparking what the story is about?
Well, one thing that interests me looking through the police files was, he did take all this. He was interested in souvenirs. He was interested in things that were very specific and recognizable and identifiable. Mm-hmm. And I think there was this feeling of, well, it didn't show up in pawn shops in the couple of years after these happened, so let's forget about them. And to my thinking was, who's to say some guy didn't die and you have to clear out your weird uncle's storage right. And then suddenly you've just put those on eBay and we could find that, So I just started to keep a list of those things. And one night the cufflinks were on the list and I just went through the list and I wrote them in and I knew they were like this 1950s antique style. They had these the first letter N, which for a man's name was kind of unusual. And they popped up. It was like one of the first Google images, and it said it was at this antique store in Oregon. And it was interesting to me that it was right over the border in Oregon. So, it wasn't Virginia. It was close to Northern California. So I just thought, okay, who doesn't want to spend $40 overnight fee for $8 cufflinks? And I emailed the woman who ran the store and said, and came up with some story about how my grandmother had lost these on a train. I mean,
so you felt compelled just to make up something that's not just like, hey, I want those cufflinks.
I started to go down that road because I thought maybe, I will admit I started to go down that road. And once she wasn't biting, she was kind of like, oh, sweet story, don't know where those came from. And I pressed a little bit more and got a little bit more information. It was like, well, we think they came from this other store. So then I had to call this other store. Once it got to that point, I thought, you know what, this is a little too DIY detective.
Right. So the DIY detective is a great part of the piece. And I think that your experience in the gray area of you exist, you as what we call DIY detective in the piece, exist in this sort of murky virtual world of a journalist, a detective, like an investigator, and a communicator with other people who share a same fascination with a particular case as you do. And the hierarchy therein is really compelling. And part of what's a really big part of your story is this message board where the fellow DIY detectives or self-described DIY detectives congregate. Mm-hmm. Talk about that board.
Yeah, it was, I should say that I've never actually, this was unique to me because I've never actually been part of this sort of message board community before. Uh-huh. But when I was so gripped by Crompton's book, I Googled East Area Rapist, Original Line Stalker, and this came up, this link to the A&E Cold Case Files message board. And I was just, for someone like me, again, it's like, oh, wow, look at all these. Oh, wow, look at, it's like you're both sort of like, wait, who would spend, all this time? Well, me, I guess, because it's a week later and I've read 20,000 posts.
And I just have to say how weird it is. And I did not know that this subculture existed until I met you, that A&E, which is like home of hoarders and intervention and all of these kind of like raw reality shows, has a message board devoted to Cold Case Files, a TV series, like a cheesy TV series. I remember being on like midnight on basic cable or whatever, and it was canceled in 2006. Yet this message board still exists, and it's this hive of
they have their own language. Like if you don't know what they're saying, it's like don't even, it's like there's just they throw around clues. It's that if you kind of went on there and go, well, what are you guys talking about? This green fibers. I don't even think they would pay attention to you because it's like you have to catch up to where they're at. You know?
So you started as someone who was just kind of just reading from the outside, a lurker.
Right.
How did you work your way into developing the credibility with the community there to the point where there are people that are featured in the story who are part of the board? They're the kid and a woman that we call the social worker. And they're two key characters in the data mining of the Golden State Killer story. Talk about a little bit about the arc of how you gained access or how you gained interest and trust.
I mean, I saw once I had posted about the case on my blog, I saw that the kid mentioned it on the message board, and I was pleased, I guess, to admit that he said my favorite true crime blogger Michelle McNamara has written about this case, and so
you were sort of lurking, and then you see your name like, oh, that's
right, and so I chimed in, hey, I'm Michelle, and I'm here, and I'm reading. And they all kind of said hey, and then I kind of joined the discussion really as a rookie novice. I mean, it was like I didn't know the language yet at all. So
right.
It was
because you had read this book by Larry Crompton and then about Erons, and then just Googled it. So you were just stepping in to this hurricane of of information.
And I'm just not, there's something about message board. I don't know if it's the format or what. It's not something that I am into or good at. So I just I saw who seemed to be some of the like kind of leaders on the board, and I just began kind of personal messaging with them.
Right.
And so the social worker was one of the first that we just kind of went back and forth a little bit. And
by the way, in the story, we call him the kid and the social worker because generally, and I think in at least in the case of the social worker, she didn't want her real name to appear in print, just to sort of protect her anonymity.
Right.
Because, and I sense this with you too, is that there's kind of this sense of it's a whole other life and identity that's lived that some people don't want other people to know about, or made public.
Right. So then we kind of started just exchanging ideas and theories and things like that. But it was mostly on my end, it was mostly all through, I kind of gave them my regular email address, and we just kind of forged a friendship, a strange friendship over this strange 30-year-old case. The sort of theme, it's overt, but it's also underlying throughout this piece is obsession. It's your obsession. It's many people's obsession, from the detectives to these online detectives to you, and you're in this hybrid space. What's curious to me is the relationship that develops between the real detectives, the meat space detectives who are out in flesh and blood, and the digital world. And you have this kind of like both one foot in each place in a way as a liaison between these two in communication. Did you notice a shift in the actual detective's point of view from these people are just a bunch of weirdos on a message board site and a bunch of cranks, to, hey, there might actually be something that they're doing here that might interest us? I mean, yeah, I did. I mean, I should say, even from my perspective with the blog, people are often surprised to hear that I have almost zero experience with disgruntled detectives or people who slam down the phone or say no. I mean, you have to remember these are cold cases that don't get a lot of love or attention.
Right.
So they're actually usually very open and willing to talk to me. And I felt with this case in particular that they really felt like it was this uphill battle, this challenge to get the word out, and that they really felt like someone out there knew this guy was going to put it together, but it needed to be put out there, and anything they could do to get the word out was going to help. So they had to think outside the box, so to speak. So I think that the detectives I talked to all felt like what they reiterated is it's a one-way street. They feel like they can give out information to people. I think they were annoyed that certain people wanted to hear back from them, and they're not so big on that. But they didn't have a problem with releasing certain information because, again, this isn't a breaking sensitive case. It's a case that is going to be solved by someone putting together the pieces years later. You know what I mean? So
right, he's an obscure serial killer with a terrible name, with a litany of crimes that were untracked by lack of detective work in multiple jurisdictions, and yet there's this driving force behind every single person in this story is the belief that he is still alive.
Right,
he's still alive, and what's really important for us is that we are helping launch this manhunt. Obviously manhunt is a big word right now with everything that's happening in Los Angeles.
Right.
But why do we think he's still alive?
Well, I just look at it as like a percentage statistic thing. He'd be in his 50s or early 60s. He was very athletic. Why wouldn't he be alive? I mean, yes, he may have died, but it's the probability is that he is probably still alive. And I think that the what was quoted to me is this actuarial study that was done. So who knows what their little variables were. I'm not so sure, but that it was 85%. So it was pretty high likelihood.
So we've got a non-smoking, exercising serial killer who has not been caught, and the likelihood of those biometrics would mean that he might still be alive,
right?
In his early 60s.
Yes, right. So I think you're not going to get uniform. Some people. I have talked to detectives who don't feel like maybe he's not alive. but and most of them, it seemed to me, at least, think that that's a possibility, and even if he's dead, feel like someone probably has the information still that could put it together.
So part of this story is discussing for the first time releasing evidence, which we won't get into for this podcast, but releases evidence that really helps reboot this case. It is additional evidence that has never been seen before, that was recently acquired by one of the detectives in their counties, that we post and publish in the magazine, that is so crucial that it will relaunch possibly. It could change things. It could actually happen that somebody recognizes something in the evidence that we provide.
That's the hope for sure. That's the hope for sure. It was evidence that was found in 1978 in Danville, outside a scene of a rape, and they know that it's a DNA-connected case, so they know it was the East Area rapist. Mm-hmm. 2 independent bloodhounds went to the same place. It was kind of near some railroad tracks, a short distance from the house where he attacked. The feeling was that this was a place where he had parked and then got into a vehicle. So these were 3 pieces of paper, notebook paper, 3-ring binder, kind of notebook paper that they felt like had been dropped. It's somewhat curious evidence because, some of it looks like almost homework, mm-hmm, and then it's right. But then there's let me put it this way. There's different skill levels to the pages. Right. So one thing looks to me like homework, and then you'd have to have a certain skill level to do that map, a hand-drawn map of like what looks like a planned community.
Right. And
as one of the detectives, I thought so interestingly pointed out, when he showed it to a bunch of different people, someone who is a landscape architect, I believe that was who it was, or a civil planner, looked at it and said, "Oh yeah, it's kind of common for people who people in our field to have dyslexia, and this seems like someone who's really struggles with language, who's
right.
writing these things.
Right.
So it wouldn't be uncommon to have these skills and then also this stuff." So that's something that I think that they are considering as
right.
well.
So you make a good point in the piece where the Unabomber was caught by the
Manifesto,
and his brother. In the philosophy, or however you would describe, his beliefs were
anti-technology beliefs. Yeah,
were so in line with what his brother knew about him that he could say, "I think I know this guy." Mm-hmm. So our ambition is to use the handwriting samples. We've got a voice sample. We've got other things that we publish in the piece and online that could be one of those trigger things. That is, I know that guy. Mm-hmm. You think it could be, I'm married to that guy.
Right. I mean, I think it's unique handwriting. I think there's some unique use of language that someone might recognize.
And you also think that he might be living a quiet life somewhere as a
Yeah, I mean,
dad.
I think that has changed too. I think the feeling used to be these guys don't stop. These violent offenders, they either get put in jail or they die. That's why they stop. We can now see that BTK, the Green River Killer, they were just suburban guys who had settled down with families and for the most part had totally stopped. So I think that the paradigm has shifted a bit and they've now opened themselves up to like, that's not always the case. Sometimes it's kind of sounds weird and horrible to say. It's like, just like anybody else, serial killers kind of slow down and I know that it sounds awful, but I think that's true. I think that they don't have the adrenaline. They don't have the energy.
Vaulting those fences in my back and tying the knots.
Yeah, I mean, it's just...
I definitely don't mean to make light of it, but one of the most hilarious details that we discussed, and I don't think we could make a finer point of it in the piece, but is that his initial attacks happen like after midnight or something, and then his attacks as he gets sort of older, like it's 10 p.m.
Yeah. It's like it's weird.
If this happens now, I can still be in bed by like 11:30.
Yeah, who knows?
There's no traffic.
Who knows? Yeah,
it's strange to think about sort of the banal details of those things. And again, I'm not making light of it, but something that I think we've talked about a lot is how I've been really shocked by a lot of the violence and the details in the piece, and you haven't. Mm-hmm. And this is intriguing to me because you've been now studying this culture or genre for so long and looking at it as a puzzle that you're sort of like distant from it.
Right. A little desensitized, maybe.
Yeah, desensitized, or you've extrapolated just the key parts of logic and puzzle that you need, and the horror doesn't really affect you anymore. Is that something?
Well, I'm not sure.
Really?
I still don't probably have a good night's sleep, every night, and thank God for Ambien. But
wait, is this because you're not sleeping because you're researching things all night, or that you're
more just
out?
that it's in my head? It doesn't make for like a peaceful existence. That doesn't mean I'm stopping it, but I certainly think it's kind of wormed its way into my brain a bit.
Yeah, you have a husband, you're married to Patton Oswalt, and you have a young daughter, and something that you explore in this story of how that's affected, especially how that's affected your relationship or your time spent with your daughter.
Yeah, and it's not like I'm raising my daughter on like apple juice and autopsy photos or something. I feel like a lot of people are always like, well, how do you have a daughter and read about murder? It's like, well, yeah, it happened. I'm certainly not showing her any of this or talking about it with her.
Well, you've got a window of time, right? You've
yes.
got a window of time where you can do that. Like these are your
preschool.
Murder study years.
Yes.
So when she gets older, and I guess this is a good way to kind of wrap up the podcast, because what if we catch this guy? What if, crazy thought, but what if we actually do catch this guy and you get the satisfaction of knowing and the relief and the puzzle is solved, that the piece that you published in LA Mag and all the work that we did helps land this dude? What are you going to do next? Is that going to be?
Oh my God, that's a terrible question.
Are you done? Was this the thing, and then, or is this going to be we're going to go on to the next thing? And
probably go on to the next thing.
That research rapture is just going to meld into another killer. And by the way, I would love that, because I'd love for you to do another feature for us really soon after you take a break. But
no, I think that, part of me can't even wrap my brain around. I can't imagine, feeling the same way about another case and how invested I became in this case. It's hard for me to even imagine that happening. But that would be ideal if it did happen, but something, I guess I haven't put this, spotlight on myself in the same way, but something I have often sort of in the back of my head thought about the message board is, what will happen if this case gets solved? Because this does seem to fulfill something for a lot of people, this kind of puzzling out of the clues and stuff. And if you have the answer, you have the answer, and it's not a mystery anymore. And you kind of wonder about that. But
yeah, what's going to happen to the kid and all these people that have spent 4,000 hours looking at this stuff? Do you think that the profile of the person that searches these things out just will then move on to something else, or was Iran and the Golden State Killer just the guy?
It was the guy. I really think for a lot of them it was the guy. I don't think, because I know them pretty well, well enough that they're not spending this amount of attention on other cases. I think this was the guy. I think they felt like they could help find him. And as one of the detectives said, it's like another reason they felt comfortable putting some of these clues out there and coordinating a little bit with the message board. It's like people have different skill sets. They have different bases of knowledge, and they wanted to use that. And I think they were hoping some of those people on the message board would, and to their credit, I've read their theories about the decal that was seen on the car. They're really good theories. They're really well researched. They're smart. There's the occasional crank, but it's pretty well done stuff. So I don't know what will happen, but I do hope he's caught. But
it's hard to deny, and you say this really well in the piece, that technology is the key thing that will help facilitate his capture. And you very sort of artfully phrase it as, in his day, the way that you stalk someone is by standing out. When he was the predator, you stood outside someone's window, and that's how you stalked someone, and that's how you got into their life. Well, now you can research him and stalk him from a computer, from
right.
from a laptop, And the
Right.
windows are opening up around him.
Right, and the DNA lab and everything. It's like there's so many ways to kind of find people now that, you just sort of feel like he's got nowhere else to hide at a certain point. One or two of these things are going to come together, and we're going to have a name. So.
Well, let's hope so. And in the March issue of Los Angeles Magazine, you can read the 7,000-plus word feature that you wrote that is also part of a companion experiment online with doing a Help Us Catch a Killer.
Yeah, take a look at the handwriting, take a look at the map, listen to the voice. Do you know that person?
Yeah. And Michelle, this was your first magazine feature. And I don't need to tell you this because I've told you this many times, but it is an extraordinary piece of writing that I hope becomes a book. And if we whether he's caught or not, I find that this experiment and what you're doing is on a forefront that we haven't yet seen. I think culturally. So, Michelle, thank you so much for writing that piece for Los Angeles Magazine, and I am looking forward to seeing, number one, what people's reaction is to the piece, and number two, if we do end up catching the Golden State Killer.
Thank you so much.